Hello everybody. In this video I'm going to be talking through the Carol Rumens poem The Emigrée from 1993, so very much towards the more modern end of the spectrum that we are looking at in your GCSE Power and Conflict anthology. Before we start with that then, a couple of key notes in terms of the sort of biography context for Rumens the writer. First of all then, born in 1944 in England, for most of her career she has been a lecturer in English literature, noted particularly for the amount of time that she spent travelling in Eastern Europe and Russia, and indeed that is an area that she feels such a strong connection with, and that she has published a number of translations of works by Russian writers, particularly poetry. Now, I would suggest that it is the experience of that region that perhaps informs her interest in the subject matter of this poem, An Emigrée, a migrant, because that area in the 20th century is somewhere that is associated with terrific disruption. It was fought over in the First World War, particularly violently in the Second World War. After the Second World War, much of Eastern Europe was then absorbed by the USSR and ruled very strictly and very authoritatively throughout much of the second half of the 20th century up until sort of the early 1990s. So I suppose then that it is some of that sort of history of disruption and the migration that's associated with that that will inspire this. I mean, particularly in the late 1940s, the number of people who fled Eastern Europe when it came under Russian rule is said to have been the biggest mass migration in human history. So I suppose that's the kind of background that we're talking about here. And it's also the fact that this is published 1993, so written early 1990s. It's interesting then that this is set against the end of that particular tyranny and the return of democracy to Eastern Europe. Now, in terms of the significance of the title, well, yes, specifically an émigré is a migrant. As those of you who study French will know, the double E ending there signifies that it is a feminine gendered noun, so specifically it's a female migrant. But it's not a direct translation, because in English we have the word migrant, we also have the word émigré, and émigré has more refined implications, more sort of upper class, if you like, implications. It is something that is less stigmatized than the idea of a migrant itself, which, for lots of reasons, not all of them particularly attractive ones, is a term that is quite often stigmatized and abused. But in this poem, there's nothing of that. In fact, if anything, it's quite celebratory towards some aspects of the kind of imaginative migrant experience. So, a few key bits of vocabulary and concepts before we begin. Now, first of all, one of the images in the poem, it references this idea of a hollow doll. Now, while this isn't explicit, then I would imagine that what we're talking about here is what's known as a Russian doll, the traditional toy of interlocking dolls that slot one inside the other, as you'll see in the illustration on the top right. Now, the bright filled paperweight. Now, in my mind, I always see something sort of snow globe type there, again, like the illustration in the bottom right-hand corner. I mean, it could simply be sometimes you have something that's brightly coloured trapped in, for example, the glass of a paperweight, but you get the idea. Something that is trapped, essentially. An idyllic image which is somehow trapped is what she's going for there. And there's one technique as well that's worth mentioning because it's used in the description towards the end of this poem, something called synesthesia. technique here where something that would normally be experienced with one sense is described using the language of a different sense. So, for example, in the poem, you have that quotation, "It tastes of sunlight." Now, manifestly, sunlight does not have a flavour, but that's the point. The perception of something that would normally be experienced in one sense, described in the language of another. It's a key technique, and make sure that you spell it correctly as well. Right then, let's begin. The Emigrée. There once was a country. I left it as a child, but my memory of it is sunlight clear, for it seems I never saw it in that November which, I am told, comes to the mildest city. The worst news I receive of it cannot break my original view, the bright, filled paper-weight. It may be at war, it may be sick with tyrants, but I am branded by an impression of sunlight. The white streets of that city, the graceful slopes glow even clearer as time rolls its tanks and the frontiers rise between us, close like waves. That child's vocabulary I carried here like a hollow doll opens and spills a grammar. Soon I shall have every coloured molecule of it. It may by now be alive, banned by the state, but I can't get it off my tongue. It tastes of sunlight. I have no passport, there's no way back at all, but my city comes to me in its own white plain. It lies down in front of me, docile as paper. I comb its hair and love its shining eyes. My city takes me dancing through the city of walls. They accuse me of absence, they circle me. They accuse me of being dark in their free city. My city hides behind me, they mutter death, and my shadow falls as evidence of sunlight. Now, one of the first points that I will mention for this poem is that it has, throughout, quite a dreamlike quality. Now, partly I think this is a product of the fact that what she is describing here are these memories very much tinged with nostalgia. I think that's part of the reason for that. But I also think that these memories themselves are embroidered through this sort of daydream and this imagination, and that's why we have some of that sort of impression left with us. Now, let's begin. There once was a country. Now, immediately there, that adverb once gives us a sort of fairy tale-like quality. Again, I think it links to this idea of unreality. But as we see through this poem, that fairy tale quality is very quickly subverted, because actually this is quite a bleak poem about absence and longing and things like that. I think the first signal that this is moving away from the fairy tale idea is that ellipsis which follows the word country on that line, because straight away that is where the break with the fairy tale ends. So it leaves us with that. Really, there's quite a profound sort of caesura caused by that ellipsis in the middle of that first line. I left it as a child, but my memory of it is sunlight clear. Now that adjective, or perhaps adjectival phrase if you prefer, sunlight clear, and indeed the word sunlight itself, is repeated in almost a sort of bell-like fashion, because it rings or sings throughout this poem, on the end of each stanza certainly, and perhaps even elsewhere. Now, the city of this imagined childhood, and that's worth noting. This is in a sense a dramatic monologue, I suppose, this poem, rather like My Last Duchess, because manifestly Carol Rumens, living in England, has not gone through this experience, but as we said, I think it draws on her time spent in Eastern Europe and Russia to create this character, hence why it can be described as a dramatic monologue. But yes, the memory of it is sunlight clear. In other words, this memory that she has is, in a sense, a dream. It's an ideal. Um, she only sees the sort of rose-tinted, nostalgic version of that. She doesn't see its flaws. And partly that's a reflection of the fact that she was a child. She would presumably have been sheltered from the worst aspects of it. But also it's an effect of the passage of time. Time has smoothed out those rough edges. And in that sense, I suppose there's a little bit of a link here to Ozymandias in the influence of time and forgetting. She goes on then, it seems I never saw it in that November, which I am told comes to the mildest city. So, November, quite a symbolically loaded term here. Now, if we think about that whole conceptual metaphor about the year being like the day, being like a life, and clearly in November we're talking about something that's coming towards the end, coming towards its bleakest point. She never saw it then. It's a kind of an admittance that her memory of it is only partial, but it also, I think, implies that this city took a turn for the worse, in whatever sense, sometime after her departure. And she goes on then, the worst news I receive of it cannot break my original view, the bright filled paperweight. So now, this I suppose then says that it's not just an act of forgetting, but it's almost a conscious thing. She's choosing to remember it how she wants to remember it, because the news cannot break it. And here you have then this metaphor of her view as a bright filled paperweight. So to explore a little bit more then this idea. Now, first of all, we associate, again, idealized scenes with these things. Nobody ever has a snow globe of a slum. It's always these rather dreamlike, fairy tale, attractive sort of locations. So again, that therefore links back to her sunlight memory that we talked about. It's also, though, a remember of the unreality of it. I think perhaps also it tells us about how she is separate from it. She cannot access it. It is inside its snow globe world. She is outside, and to try to access it, to try to go there, would be to destroy the memory, destroy the content. It may be at war. It may be sick with tyrants, but I'm branded by an impression of sunlight. Now, on the subject of this sunlight, then, here, that verb branded, then, this impact that it has on her is so very powerful that she metaphorically associates it with that idea of being physically scarred by it. So powerful is the memory that she has and that she retains and chooses to retain. When she describes it as being sick with tyrants, this is the first instance where her country or her city is, particularly the city, is personified as some kind of loved one. And we have this idea then of tyranny as a disease. Now, if we read this poem then as a criticism of tyranny, then of course that then starts to tap into poems like London, like Ozymandias, like My Last Duchess. There are a number of other ones then where we can see this. Now, in addition to all the images of light and sunlight that we see, the next stanza begins with more description, the white streets of that city. Now again, obviously the image, the colour white, the adjective white, is very much associated with things like purity and innocence and so on, and that links then directly back to and can be grouped with the idea of the sunlight clear image that she had at the beginning of this poem. And linking to this, the idea of the graceful slopes, everything really about this city of her memory is elegant and idealized, but the graceful slopes glow even clearer, so the verb glow again linking back to sunlight, and a simile now, as time rolls its tanks. Again then, you can link the simile about the tanks to the idea of tyrants. I mean, there are various images that can be drawn here, but of course the famous one is the Chinese protester in 1989 in Tiananmen Square who was crushed by a tank after he stood in front of it and they just drove over him. But it's used again as a metaphor for oppression. And that's interesting, isn't it? Because in a sense, here, whereas in some of the other poems, time destroys memory, here she argues that it doesn't, because she says that these slopes, instead of growing fainter, they grow clearer even as time rolls its tanks. So again, it's this idea that it's, for her, it's a conscious act of remembering or of memorializing. It's something that she's deliberately choosing to do. So, as time rolls its tanks and the frontiers rise between us, close like waves. Now, again then, you have the imagery of a migrant, somebody who has moved beyond the frontiers, who has left that country. And the metaphor of closing like waves is a biblical allusion to the story of Moses leading the Jews out of Egypt. And of course the story is that the Red Sea parts to allow them to escape, and then when the evil chasing Egyptians come to follow them, the sea sweeps back and drowns them all. That's the allusion there, the simile that comes from that. Now it's interesting because one of the groups who is most associated with flight from Eastern Europe, both during the Second World War and afterwards, is of course the Jewish people, either to Western Europe, to America, or to Israel. And so is there therefore an idea in this allusion that she perhaps either is Jewish, or that the character here in this dramatic monologue may be Jewish, if she identifies herself with the Jews fleeing with Moses? That image, I think, does give us that possibility. And certainly there were huge numbers in those areas that since fled. Now, it continues then. The child's vocabulary I carried here like a hollow doll opens and spills a grammar. Now, I think then the implication of this sort of metaphor here is that when she was a child, she had first of all limited ability to actually express her memories and feelings, as demonstrated by the child's vocabulary part, but also I think we can argue that her perception itself was more limited because, as she says earlier, it seems I never saw it in that November. It's a kind of acknowledgement, isn't it, that her memory from childhood was in itself small, and yet, look at that verb, it opens and spills a grammar. Did I say a metaphor, by the way? It's got like in it, it's a simile, sorry. And spills a grammar. So there's a sense then that, in a way, her memory itself has bloomed and expanded, and perhaps, if we're going to be a little cynical, we might say has been embroidered by her own desire to idealize it. Perhaps she's adding things that she couldn't really know at the time or has learnt since. She goes on then, soon I shall have every coloured molecule of it, which links back, I think, to things like the bright paperweight. You can group those two images together. But it's interesting, the idea that she's almost recovering memories that she's lost or that she never had. It's a strange idea, but again it links to this dreamlike quality, the sense that really in a way she's filling in the gaps with her imagination. She goes on then and says that her original vision of her country, or the country that she remembers, may by now be a lie banned by the state, but I can't get it off my tongue. It tastes of sunlight. And here is where the synesthesia comes in, and I think we get a sense then of the incredible, almost agonizing vividness of this memory for her, so much so that it is as if she can experience it physically, that she can taste it. And so I suppose, in a sense, maybe we say that this poem is about a memory, but perhaps actually the memory is just a manifestation. Perhaps, in a sense, what we're looking at really is the memory as a kind of manifestation of her trauma, of the power of this, of the sort of the sense of loss and dislocation that she feels, and that's why this memory is so very vivid. There is something almost refrain-like in the way that each stanza ends with the reference to sunlight. Now, normally a refrain is a feature of a ballad, which is a narrative poem or a type of narrative poem, but there's a kind of a sort of sly subversion of the ballad form here, because actually this is a poem in which nothing happens, in which return is impossible. And so actually, in a sense, rather than emphasizing progress, what these refrain lines actually do is emphasize stasis. They emphasize that she actually cannot go back, either in time or geographically. Now, the final stanza begins, I have no passport, there's way back at all. And as I said, I think this is metaphorical here, because not merely can she not go back to the country, but she cannot return to the past either. In that sense, I suppose we can say that this is slightly in the romantic tradition, in the sense that, like in the prelude, you have the idea of a sort of a physical journey that's represented as a kind of a metaphorical one. She can't travel back in time, and so instead my city comes to me in its own white plain. This is the memory, this is the city of the imagination that she has. And look at the pronouns, the possessive pronouns, first person, my city comes to me. This is something that is vividly and violently personal to her. And you'll see that there are references to me and to I and to my throughout the rest of this stanza. More so indeed than the rest of this poem, it very heavily uses these personal possessive, or these first person possessive pronouns, and so actually the intensity of her longing therefore is shown to only grow in this part of the poem. It's strange now, because we mentioned right at the very start that it is sort of seemingly personified, and I think that continues here, the idea that it visits her in its plane. It lies down in front of me, docile as paper. Now, it's a strange image really here, and I can never quite work out whether it's childlike, whether it's sort of slightly animal in like a kind of a sort of doggy kind of a sense. Whether it's whether it's childlike, whether it's even potentially like a lover. It's an odd thing, but if that's the case, if let's say for example that she does imagine it as a sort of child, it's a strange reversal, because when she was young, you have the sort of the might of a country and the insignificance of a child, and yet in this woman's dream, she now is the comforting figure. She is the adult. It is her country or her city that is now in the position of weakness, and so she dreams of being able to nurture it and to care for it and to help to restore it. Now, linking back to things like the white streets, and we talked about the innocence, obviously you've got the other reference to white on the second line of this stanza, but you've also got that similarly docile as paper. And again, it's emphasising the kind of idealised innocence of her city. She continues on again, though, and says, I comb its hair and love its shining eyes, which again I think rather links to the sort of childlikeness that we have there. It goes on then. My city takes me dancing through the city of walls. They accuse me of absence, they circle me. Now, I have to confess that I don't think I fully understand the last sort of 5 lines, the last sort of sankain of this poem. There's something about it that just doesn't quite fit. Well, first of all, I suppose we can note that if the rest of the poem, the first 2 stanzas, are octaves, which is to say that they are 8-line stanzas, this one is a nonette, in a 9-line stanza, and I suppose that gives it this slight extra discomfort because it doesn't resolve in the same way. Stanzas with even numbers of lines, generally speaking, can be relied upon to resolve and to feel relatively balanced, but this one doesn't have it. I think, therefore, it represents the growing sense of discomfort that comes through this. My city takes me dancing. Again, it's childlike, but again, it's an image of escapism. If you think back, of course, to Blood Brothers, with that verb, dancing. She dreams, therefore, of being free to enjoy it. Now, who then are they? Well, again, it's ambiguous. We don't know. Is this the authority figures there? Is this people who have stayed behind? It's ambiguous. It's unclear. Presumably it's those authority figures because she has this idea that she feels guilty for having left. And I think that's what's being represented here, her guilt. She feels guilt for having left. Perhaps it is people who've stayed who are reproaching her in this way. Perhaps it is people who have stayed and died. It's a difficult one, I think, but that's probably as plausible as anything. But this protective image continues on, that links to the idea of it's lying down in front of her, this sort of submissive image, really, and allowing her to comb its hair. But here my city hides behind me. Again, in her imagination, she is able to protect it, to save it, to do what no one person can. They mutter death, and my shadow falls as evidence of sunlight. Again, personification perhaps of the conflict that she feels. But this poem, it seems to end darkly, and yet look at the last line. My shadow falls as evidence of sunlight. In other words, the presence of a shadow only means that the sun is there. In other words, while her city may suffer, while her country may be in tatters, that shadow is only evidence of sunlight. It's only a reminder that from bad times, good will follow. And so this is a poem that ends on a notably optimistic tone. Form-wise, we've mentioned that this is a dramatic monologue, this imagined character of a migrant. We've mentioned the fact that it is written in 2 quatrains and a nonette, and about the kind of odd lack of resolution that provides. It is written, I think, in a sort of free verse, so it's quite conversational. You'll see that, for example, on line 4 of the first stanza, when you have phrases like I am told, these quite conversational phrases. So I think there's something, yes, conversational, almost confessional about the way that this is told to us. We're not, in any sense, addressed to it as an audience. We are kind of absent from the picture. But nonetheless, I think the conversational tone means that there is this sort of slight intimacy that we develop with the speaker in the poem. And again, because it's dramatic monologue, we are talking about a speaker rather than Rumens herself. So, subheadings then for your notes, the usual things then, please. So, the topic and subject of the poem and plot if applicable, please make sure that you have that. Make sure you have reference to the notes on form and structure. So, for example, structure-wise, you'll be talking about the sort of transition towards that darkening of tone and what that reflects. You'll be talking about the fact that you have that additional line in the final stanza. You'll be talking about the fact that the whole poem is structured as her kind of recollections of place, and about how she uses her recollections of place. It kind of explores her feeling of dislocation from it. And on the next slide then there are some quotation clusters for you to fill in as well. So, as usual, please ensure that these are fully detailed, like the partial example below. The 4 points are: the speaker has idealised memories of what her country was like from her childhood. 2, it seems like her country is now under some kind of oppressive regime. 3, a long time has passed. And 4, the poem ends optimistically. Those last 2 points there will be rather shorter. The first 2 points will be really quite long. For the first point then, I've given you a couple of quotations to start you off. I've said, it seems I never saw it in that November. You've got the metaphor of the end of year. You'd want to think about what that actually implies. Again, about the idealised vision of it, which contrasts to the November. Links quite neatly to the next bit, the bright filled paperweight and the reference to sunlight. Think about what they symbolise. So please make sure then that you've got the fully detailed clusters. And remember, even for this point, you need substantially more quotations, but I've just done those first 3 to start you off. So, thank you very much indeed for your time, everybody, and I will leave you there.